Hello class, today we are talking about psychological egoism. So this is the portion of the class that has to do with how it is that we're understanding this often misunderstood term, psychological egoism, and we're looking at Joel Feinberg's 1958 essay simply titled Psychological Egoism. So Feinberg was best known for his work on legal philosophy, including the limits of law over the individual, likewise extending to the authority of the state. And he was born in 1926 and died in 2004. He spent most of his career at the University of Arizona, and this essay appears early in his career while at Brown University. So Feinberg is known to be influenced by the utilitarians Jeremy Bentham and J.S. Mill. So when we hear of their points in the essay, there's added detail that Feinberg brings in beyond the fact that Bentham and Mill were utilitarians, as we studied. Okay, so they were also inquisitive philosophers in their own right, looking into the wide sphere of ethical life, including the ramifications of psychological egoism, okay, in terms of pleasure, etc., and other empirical implications on morality. So a quick glance at the subchapters of the essay give us a clear indication of Feinberg's aims to critique the overall theory of psychological egoism, and by extension, its normative corollary, which it's often confused with, that is known as ethical egoism. Okay, so basically, Feinberg outlines the theory of psychological egoism, then to the general reasoning behind it, and then to the rest of the essay. And then the rest of the essay is really a detailed account of the various confusions and the basic tenets of psychological egoism that Feinberg critiques. Okay? And so for the sake of brevity, I'll often be referring to psychological egoism as PE, unless otherwise specified. So A, the theory. So at its essence, PE is universally and widely held, a universally and widely held belief, and is often misunderstood. Is often a misunderstood descriptive theory that people are primarily driven by their own self-interest, desires, and so forth. Coupled with this understanding of PE is also the belief that we rarely act in the interest of others. And when we do find ourselves acting in the interest of others, it is thought that according to the basic tenets of PE, that these actions are also performed with self-interest as the primary motivation behind the action. For the psychological egoist, we must act to bring about happiness, the happiness of others, not for altruistic reasons. Rather, we do so to fulfill our own happiness, to fulfill their own our own egoistic desires and happiness, according to the proponents of PE. So we must also recall that altruism is really the idea that our actions in practice could be driven by our concern for the welfare and happiness of other people, above and beyond our own psychological egoism for the altruist, i.e., our actions are not always selfishly motivated, contrary to the theory of PE. We must also see that Feinberg distinguishes PE with ethical egoism. So first, by indicating that PE is a descriptive position. In other words, PE is merely a description of our actions. In fact, it is also a way of accounting for things in terms of descriptive reports, data analysis, statistical modeling, and so forth. Such descriptions of PE, however, are not to be confused with a normative account of how people ought to be, okay? So just because, and that is otherwise known as ethical egoism, just because we observe that people are selfish doesn't mean that we ought to be the same way. And likewise, we should never see a description as a prescription to be a certain way, right? So this is a huge problem, and it's also a common pitfall, okay? So with our own thinking, to the degree that psychological egoism must be understood as having ties at having this as the heart of its understanding, and also a heart of its understanding as problematic and contradictory. Okay, and also as a flawed theory then, okay? So, which is why we don't fall into the trap of confusing it for a full-on moral theory, right, from the onset, right? So if we don't see this right away, we miss the critical lessons of knowing about PE and simply stay in the sphere of opinionated delusions, okay? So, the common sense view, which runs in contrast to how we're examining PE today, is really problematic, and likewise the main thrust of what it is that Feinberg is doing to critique PE and to also see it as not a legitimate moral theory. Okay, so we have to see that Feinberg goes on to describe PE with the help of Jeremy Bentham, who characterized the position of PE also as having the component of pleasure as the motivation behind any number of actions, pursuits, desires held under the banner of PE. In other words, the driver for psychological egoism is often thought of as selfishly ego-driven. Another name for the technical term psychological egoistic hedonism, as Feinberg identifies it. So then we go on to Feinberg's subchapter, prima facie reasons in support of the theory. So we have to note that the term prima facie really just means something like at first glance. Basically, these are the first glance reasons given in support of PE. So these are ways in which PE is initially looked at and thought to be justified according to Feinberg. Before we refer to Feinberg's list, we must also note a couple of points. One is obviously that Feinberg is not in defense of this position, the theory of PE. And also, we must insist that on not only referring to just men as he does, and refer to men, women, and children, right? i.e. everyone. So the first reason, A, offered by Feinberg in support of the theory of PE, is captured with the characterization of selfishness that is self-perpetuated by the pleasure we get from actions that are pleasurable because they support my own self-interest. Okay, whenever I do something, I do so because I'm self-interested, and this is pleasurable for the psychological egoist. Okay, so then to B, when we get what we want, we feel pleasure for the psychological egoist, and other pursuits only then serve as a way to obtain this pleasure. Okay? Then there's C, which is a justification for the PE position by way of self-deception. That is to suggest that the psychological egoist believes that all aims, noble and otherwise, are only self-appealing. That is, we act ethically to embellish our own ego. In other words, it's foolish to think for the psychological egoist that such lofty terms like duty, virtue, are none other than selfishly driven ethical pursuits, right? Remember, PE is just a description of how we really are, rather than what we should do or how we ought to act and desire. And then likewise, it could also be a description of how it is that we ought to act. So in other words, when you're just describing it, you're describing a position that is ethical. So that's somewhat of a confusing point too, but that's something to note. Sometimes that's confusing for students, right? So we smile to have people think positive thoughts about us. We give to charity to aggrandize our own self. The golden rule is the best way because it's the way in which PE is justified morally, or better said, how morals are used to justify the theory of PE on subjective grounds, right? So whereby cynically this position is morally instrumental to our self-interest. That is for Bentham characterized as the interplay of pleasure and pain. If the action fulfills my ego-driven desire, then I should do it, okay? Whether it's egoistic or not. If the action is painful, then if the action is painful and thwarts my desire, then I avoid it. So here, we should be keen to note that again, this is still a description of PE. That is, we are describing moral behavior. We are not offering a prescription. Recall that a prescription is merely implied and observed. It is not the prescription itself. So then Feinberg moves on to his critique of psychological egoism, which is really just having to do with confusion, right? That stems from justifications we just mapped out. Okay, so I'm gonna stop here and start a second video and take it from there.